absolute bottom line, people who treat others like they like to be treated. That's what it means to believe in Jesus and to follow him. Jesus has drawn a stark contrast between two different types of righteousness. One is shallow and it centers on us. The other is life-changing and it centers on others. The conclusion is something like this. It's like Jesus saying, I've told you what true righteousness is. Now it's up to you to choose whether or not you will embrace and practice it. That's what today's passage is all about. Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 29. Jesus speaks with a level of moral confidence and clarity that is shocking to his original audience. They were shocked that he spoke with such authority, that he seemed to know what he was talking about, and that he didn't talk in shades of gray. He talked in black and white. He talked as though he knew what he was talking about, and it was shocking to those who heard it at the time. There's no wavering. There's no couching his terms. He's reached the end of the sermon, and he's asking us to make a choice. That's what today's passage is all about. The right choice leads to well done, my good and faithful servant. The wrong choice leads to away from me, you evildoer. I have no idea who you are. These are some of the most difficult verses in the Bible. I recall reading these verses as a child or as a teenager and experiencing great anxiety, wondering if I was one of those who had made the right choice, or if I might be one of those who Christ would say, I don't know who you are. Here's the big idea for today's message. Choosing to follow Jesus leads to life. Choosing not to leads to destruction. Those are strong words, and those are not pleasant words, but those are the words of Jesus. So first of all, as we move through this passage, what we are talking about, we're talking about entering the kingdom of heaven. And entering the kingdom of heaven is Jesus' way of talking about what some of us may be used to hearing the phrase getting saved. When Jesus talks about entering the kingdom of heaven, it's the same thing as when people talk about coming to salvation or entering a relationship with Christ. So first of all, that's what Jesus is talking about. Second, when we talk about following Jesus into the kingdom, we are talking about actions, not mere belief. Jesus is not saying just believe a few of the right things and everything is going to be okay. Believe this, and this, bow your head, say a prayer, and you're all set. Jesus is calling us to discipleship. He's asking us to follow him. He's asking us to rearrange our lives around the principles of the Sermon on the Mount. Many of us, maybe even most of us, have been exposed to an understanding of salvation that wasn't taught by Jesus and isn't in the Bible. That's that idea that we simply bow our head and ask Jesus into our heart and then wait until we get to go to heaven. That's not the gospel that Christ preached. Christ said, there is a cost to following me, but I invite you to get on the path. I invite you to conform your life to my teachings. Follow me, believe in me, and I will change your life now and for all eternity. James 2, verse 19 says, you believe that this is the brother of Jesus Christ speaking to the first church in Jerusalem. You believe that there is one God, good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. The point that James is making, and the point that I'm trying to make this morning, is that it's not enough just to believe a few of the right things about God. It's not enough just to attend, find a good church and to attend it. But the type of discipleship that Jesus is calling us to is a radical type of discipleship that will change our lives. And that's the invitation before us today. First point in my message is that Jesus makes in the Sermon on the Mount is we face a choice about life. We're going to look at the last 4 paragraphs of the Sermon on the Mount, and the first main point is we face a choice about life. This is verses 13 and 14. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few will find it. What made Jesus such a great teacher is his ability to convey his message with stories and with powerful images. Jesus could take a complex topic or a serious topic, and he could break it down to a very simple image that's very easy to understand. So here's the picture that Jesus creates. We're on a journey, and we have come to a Y in the road. There are 2 gates leading to 2 paths. One is a wide gate leading to a wide path. The other is a narrow gate leading to a narrow path. At this point in Jesus' story, you can see the gate, you can see the beginning of the path, but at this point you cannot see where the path leads. You've come to a Y in the road, 2 gates, 2 paths, and Jesus says, I've finished my teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. I have finished describing the type of righteousness that surpasses that of the Pharisees. I've finished describing the type of righteousness that leads to entering the kingdom of heaven. Now you have a choice to make. A couple things about this choice. Number one, it is a critical choice. It's a critical choice. Jesus uses very stark imagery because he wants us to understand the gravity of the choice before us. Jesus could have come up with a softer image. He could have said, here's a way of life. Try it and see if you like it. But it's a critical choice. It's a critical choice because according to Jesus, one of the paths leads to destruction. This is the broader path. And initially, this looks like the easier path. Many people are on this path, according to Jesus. And the broader path is the path of least resistance. In fact, it doesn't even feel like a choice to get on the broader path. Went down to see Marvin Riley's place on the Ohio River. And we're driving down the road, and it would be very, very easy to keep on going. The road was straight, the road was paved, it was easy to see, and you have to really look hard to find Marvin and Karen's driveway. It is tough to spot. And it would be very easy to drive right past it, but it required a conscious decision to turn off the main road, the road that was easy and that was clear, and to turn on this very narrow road that led to a different destination. So this is a critical choice. The other gate is narrow. It leads to a narrow path. But this is the path that leads to the kingdom of heaven. Those on the narrow path are the people who believe in Jesus and who are living the Sermon on the Mount. That's the definition of this narrow path. It's a critical choice. It's also an either-or choice. Jesus doesn't lay out multiple options and say, pick the one that fits for you. He provides this very clear point of decision saying you have 2 options now. You may choose a path that will lead to destruction, or you may choose a path that leads to life. That is your decision. Scott McKnight is a writer who I really like, who's written a great commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. This is what he wrote at this point in the message. He said, "This is not a matter of more or less successful attempts to follow the lifestyle of the kingdom of heaven, but of being in or out, saved or lost. Jesus has set forth his vision for how kingdom people are to live, and then he looks them in the eye and he summons them to follow him. Sorting all people into two seems brutal in our world, but we cannot soften the rigor of Jesus' words." These are hard words. I have wrestled with these passages. I've struggled with them on a personal level and had to search my soul. And as Jesus moves into the next few paragraphs, he continues to paint a picture of stark differences. So we've got these two paths, two gates, a narrow gate and a narrow path, broad gate, broad path, stark images. Now the next stark image is, he says, there are false prophets and there are true prophets. So the next point is that there are some spiritual leaders who will encourage you to make the wrong choice. Jesus says there are some voices of religious authority, people who claim to speak for God, who will lead you in the wrong direction. He says they look safe, but aren't. Christ says, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Sheep, nothing looks safer than sheep, right? They're warm and fuzzy, they're kind of friendly, they generally don't attack you. And Jesus says, there are false prophets who look like sheep. They look safe. They look cuddly. It's easy to side up against them. But Jesus says behind a facade that looks like a sheep is a ferocious wolf who will devour you. Strong words. Devour is a powerful, strong word, and it's a word that Jesus chooses to use. Then what Jesus says is that the fruit of their lives will determine whether or not you should listen to them. So this middle part of the conclusion is really a challenge to people who claim to speak for God, to people who are spiritual leaders, to people who are pastors, to people who are elders or Sunday school teachers. It's a challenge to us to examine our lives. Jesus goes on to say, starting in verse 16, by their fruit you will recognize them. So in other words, you can't recognize them by their outer appearance. They may look like sheep, but you can identify them by the fruit of their lives. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. Every good spiritual leader will bear good fruit. Bad leaders, bad pastors, bad televangelists, bad university presidents, whatever they may be, their lives will bear bad fruit. And Jesus says that the leaders who bear bad rather than good fruit will be cut down and thrown into a fire. Question this should lead to is, what is the fruit that we should look for? So we're to evaluate leaders by the fruit of their lives. In the context of the Sermon on the Mount, what is the fruit that you should look for? You should look for the fruit of neighbor love. The doing unto others as you would have them do unto you fruit. That's the kind of lifestyle you look for in a spiritual leader worthy of following. I remember interacting with a spiritual leader one time, and it was a person who had a huge ministry. Multiple churches. Spoke on the radio. All kinds of things. And I thought it would be great for some of the students that I worked with to have a chance to meet this leader and interact with him. So I invited a bunch of people to come together and to meet with this person. And he was the rudest, nastiest person I have ever interacted with. Students would ask a question, he would insult them and make fun of them. They couldn't believe what I was seeing. But he looked safe. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people were following him and supporting his ministry, and it has come to a crash. Person's no longer at the church. The church has fired him. The church, the board and the church the board and the pastor are suing one another. It's all come crumbling down, and people should have seen it coming had they examined the fruit of this person's life. He was not treating others, and he had a consistent reputation for not treating others the way he would want to be treated, for not loving his neighbors as he loved himself. And then in the next breath, Jesus says that some who claim to know Jesus won't even be in the kingdom of heaven. Verse 21, this is one of the hardest paragraphs in the Bible. Verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evil doers. That's how Jesus chooses to end the story. There's a play going on in this paragraph on a word that isn't immediately evident in the English. It's more evident in the Greek. There's a play on the word name. What's going on? So what they're saying is these false prophets, these people who look good on the outside but are actually wolves who will devour you, they say, Jesus, in your name we have prophesied. In your name, we have fought evil. We have cast out demons. In your name, we have done things that are absolutely miraculous. And then Jesus replies, let me say this very plainly. I don't know your name. Away from me, you evildoer. And then for the conclusion, Jesus tells a story that even a child can understand. One of the simplest stories in the Bible. It's one that children learn to sing about at a very early age. Let me read these verses. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Now, I'm going to do something that will annoy some of you. I'm going to tell you to ignore the rest of the outline that's in your book. So some of you are very disciplined at filling out the outline, my sermon outlines. But this morning, as I was practicing my sermon, I decided the outline that I had was not the best way to describe this passage, and that it didn't convey the full weight of what Jesus is saying. So I'm departing from that. So please bear with me. Here's the closing challenge in these closing paragraphs of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus and the things that he taught in the Sermon on the Mount are the foundation for life in the kingdom of heaven. It is the key to righteousness that surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. It's finding and entering through the narrow gate that leads to life. Practicing the words of Jesus as he's taught them in the Sermon on the Mount is the beginning of life in the kingdom of heaven. And it is so important that Jesus doesn't just lay out the good news. He also chooses to end his sermon with a warning. These are the words of Christ. This is how Jesus chose to end the sermon that would define him. The broad path is going with the flow. It's going through the motions of righteousness without a wholehearted devotion to following Jesus Christ. It might even include prophesying about God, fighting evil and doing things that seem miraculous. But without a core commitment to Jesus Christ that includes a willingness to conform to what he has laid out for us in the Sermon on the Mount, it will not stand up to the storms of life and to the final judgment. It's a path that leads to destruction, just as sure as it is that houses built on sand will eventually crumble and fall apart. Like Jesus closed the Sermon on the Mount with an invitation to take the narrow path and choose the life of the kingdom, I close today's message with an invitation for all of us not only to turn our eyes upon Jesus, but to give him our lives, to devote ourselves from this point forward to loving our enemies, to greeting strangers, to turning the other cheek and going the extra mile, to serving God in secret when no one is looking to see what we are doing, to not judging others, to not worrying about life, but pursuing treasures in heaven, and to doing unto others as we would want them to do unto us. That is the way of Jesus. That is the invitation that he leaves before us today. And this is a moment, I think, for some of us maybe have never thought seriously about this. This may be a moment for someone to say, I want to follow Jesus. I want to give my life to him, and I'm going to live that kind of life from this point forward. For others of us may have made that choice, and it's a time to reevaluate our lives and to say, am I really living the kind of kingdom life that Jesus has outlined in this amazing sermon called the Sermon on the Mount? And when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as someone who had authority and not as their teachers of the law.